Welcome to the last part of this lesson, and this one deals with convenience initializers. If you'll recall from the last couple of parts that the init method is a method that is called automatically when a new object is created. And what is the purpose of the init method? It is to give all of the properties in the class default initial values, and this init method is defined in the class and is automatically invoked when a new object is created. But sometimes when you are designing a class, you may not have, or you may want to have a mix of different init methods. For instance, you could have one init method assuming some defaults, while another init method might require the passing of some additional parameters, but ultimately these initializers all funnel into a single method known as the designated initializer. Now, the designated initializer or init method is typically the init method with the most number of parameters. If you have several init methods, the one with the most number of parameters, that takes the most number of parameters, is known as the designated initializer. Now, Swift allows you to create several init methods, and these different init methods are known as convenience initializers. Now, you may ask, why can't we just have one init method? Why do we need to have several init methods? Or why do we need to have convenience initializers? What is the benefit of having convenience initializers or more than one init method? Well, the benefit is, there's two benefits actually. The first one, it can save us time when we create new objects by typing less parameters and assuming the other parameters are defaults. So it saves us typing time. Another reason why we would want to use more than one init method or use these convenience initializers is sometimes we don't know the values of some of the properties when the object is initially created. Only as we move through the program, the other properties get their initial values, but we may want to give them default values for starters, and we don't really know what their final values are going to be. So that was a lot of theory about convenience initializers. Let's do an example, and maybe the example will throw some light on what we're talking about. So here I'm defining a class called tractor, and this tractor has two properties: horsepower, which is an int, and the color of the tractor, which is a string. So it has two properties. Now, whenever we create new objects of this class, we will need to set these properties with default values. So normally what we do is we create an init method, and this init method would take two parameters, and we could, when the object is created, we can pass two parameters to it: the horsepower and the color, and these two input parameters will then set the properties of this tractor. So this is the normal init method we've been creating, but this init method has got a special name. Because the total number of parameters here is the total number of properties here is 2, and the total number of parameters it takes is 2, we say that this initializer, because it's taking the maximum amount of parameters that match the properties, This initializer is called a designated initializer. It has a special name. So a designated initializer is an initializer with the most number of properties. Now what if I want to create another initializer within the same class? I can. And here I'm creating a new init method, but this init method only takes one parameter, which is the horsepower. And since it doesn't take the maximum of 2, it's known as a convenience initializer. And we'll put in the keyword convenience. So if it's only going to take one parameter, for the object needs 2 parameters, where is it going to get the other parameter or the second parameter? The one parameter will come in when the object is initialized, horsepower. We'll pass that through the convenience initializer. The other parameter is assumed to be a default. Okay. So this convenience initializer is a method that accepts one parameter, uses a default for the second parameter, and then calls the default initializer to initialize the 2 parameters. One's the input parameter and the other the default. Let's create another convenience initializer. Now this convenience initializer, also called init, keyword convenience, but this initializer does not accept or does not take any input parameters. So if it does not take any input parameters, where is it going to get the values for the properties, the default values? We are going to give it some defaults. Because nothing came in, we are going to assign horsepower of 42 and a color of green. And then we're going to call the designated initializer to initialize this object if no parameters came in. So that was the definition of the class. Brief recap, we've created the class with 2 properties. It has 3 initializers. 2 of them are called convenience initializers. This one and this one. The reason why we call them convenience initializers, they don't take the maximum number of parameters. And we call this initializer here the designated initializer because it takes the maximum number of parameters. And every convenience initializer, the last statement must call the designated initializer. Here again, this convenience initializer, the last statement here must call the designated initializer. Now that our class is created, let's try and make some objects of this class. Okay, so the first object I'm making is called my big tractor, of class tractor. Now notice I'm not passing any parameters when I'm creating this object. Default values. So where it's going to get the default values from? It will automatically call, because there's no parameters here, it will automatically call this convenience initializer. And this convenience initializer will give it the 2 default values of 42 and green. Let's check if my big tractor has 42 and green. Yes, it's got a horsepower of 42 and it's got a color of green. Now let's create another object called my big tractor. It's also of class tractor, but this time I'm passing a parameter, just the horsepower. So if I'm only passing horsepower of 71, where is it going to get the color from? Well, what will happen is once we create this object, it will call this default initializer or convenience initializer that has one parameter, this one. The one parameter will be passed and the other parameter will be assumed to be green. That's why my big tractor has horsepower of 71 and a default color of green. Now let's create our third object. This time I'm creating my yard tractor, the object called my yard tractor of class tractor, and I'm passing two default parameters, 16 and orange, two of them. I'm passing the maximum number of parameters. So in this case, these convenience initializers will not be called, but the default initializer, which is the designated initializer, up here will be called because I passed in two parameters. And that's how the convenience initializers work. It actually saves us some typing time. Like here, if we do not want to put in any parameters and assume the defaults, we just need to type in tractor. We don't need to pass any parameters to it unless we want to. So you could have more than one initializer to save you some time. So thank you so much for watching this entire lesson. When we get back, we'll move on to lesson number 7.